Okay, good then. I was not able to drink coffee in the networking room, but maybe some of you were able to do so. Welcome back. We go to the next session in which we have a very tight schedule, which does not only require something from the speakers, but also from the audience, because I propose to have this setup of 3 key findings by the speakers, but then also followed by 3 questions from the audience. So I would really like to stimulate a bit of interaction with you, so with the audience. So prepare while you listen to the presentation a question, so that we have 3 slides from the presenter, 3 questions from the audience. And I take the first 3 questions that I see. So be quick. And we also actually wait for some questions. So prepare. Yeah, Robert, we know that you are in another meeting and that you will present a bit later. So yeah, we start with Alfons. Alfons Baumann from EAAMO led the work on the farm demographics questions. Alfons, I see you already in the screen, so that's promising. I gave you a difficult task. 3 conclusions, 3 key findings. So there you go. And audience, prepare 3 questions. Alfons, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Thank you. Are you understanding me?
Yes, perfect. And then we see your slides.
Okay, let me start with the topic of future farm demographics and intergenerational renewal in EU farming systems. And I would like to address 3 points. The first is a question: is there a young farmers problem in the EU? This concern is driven eventually by the retirement of the baby boomer generation in the next 10 to 15 years, and the fact that the cohorts of the upcoming generations Y and Z are much smaller in size, and many farms may not have a potential successor at all, and that there may be an increasing scarcity of qualified labor to hire. On the other hand, we have agricultural challenges. On the one hand, many or most farms in the EU are neither profitable nor operating state of the art. We have a fierce competition among farms, particularly for land, and wages for agricultural employees are rather low. And if there is a young farmers problem, then it is not just about farm succession, it is rather about qualification and the needs of future farming systems, and it is about the attractiveness of working in agriculture. So, for example, what does it mean if farms do not have a successor? We found that societal functions will just be taken over by other farms. We run simulations where we find that all the farms is just managed by other farms, and the production is also not affected very much by leaving of some farms. And that also has implications, for example, with regard to the EU young farmer payments, where we do not find any substantial effects. It's rather a waste of money. Eventually, there are some psychological effects for starters. So the shift of policy should be much more to focus on quality instead of quantity, and to support, for example, rather business plans. With regard to policy recommendations, we found a number of issues. One issue is that the policies needs to be region-specific and systemic. That means not just focusing on one instrument, but to look at the policy mix. There is moreover a need for clear and consistent policies instead of mixed messages, as we find currently. That is the outcome of particularly stakeholder and meetings, for example. Then we see a need for improvement of education and training, not just with a focus on production, but also with regard to management of more complex farms and the preparation for lifelong learning. Then there is a need to increase the attractiveness of farming as a kind of occupation and lifestyle. That means we have to address the compatibility of farming as an occupation with leisure, work-life balance, and other issues which address eventually also the preferences of the younger generations better than of the baby boomers. And we have to think about infrastructures for young families and migrant workers. And last but not least, there is a demand for policies looking at alternative business models and supporting innovations, not just innovations with regard to products, but also with regard to production systems, but also eventually policies should look more at, for example, opportunities for shared or cooperative farming. That's it from my side. Many thanks.
These key findings on the farm demographic perspective and on a generational renewal. So Carolina, can I see the key questions? Alphonse, you don't have questions so far. So now we should wait for questions.
I was too fast, but eventually we can.
So actually the generational renewal was one of the starting points of Sure Farm. So there was all these concerns about the graying of the farm sector in Europe. And that was one of the starting points of the project. And you indicate with your team that don't worry too much because these farms will be taken over by other farms. And if that is done in a resilient way, it's okay. Is that indeed your conclusion?
Yes, in principle, there are many opportunities for the agricultural sector to adapt. And the question is, what is the most important concern? And the most important concern is eventually, and that has partly also been shown by the COVID crisis, that workforce is available in time. And that means we have to be much more aware of hired labor and also the conditions of work of hired labor, for example, with regard to safe jobs and working standards. But also we have to address the issue of mobility, also across countries, across borders. And we have to be aware that, for example, the wage levels are still relatively low, partly even below what should be the standard.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, so indeed, you also not only looked at farm succession, but also to the availability of skilled labor. And what is your key recommendation there? And then we go to a question. So how to attract skilled labor, how to do it?
One issue is to be aware that the attractiveness of farming improves. We have currently a number of issues. The work-life balance is an issue which may be particularly important for the so-called Generation Y, which eventually is not focusing that much just on income and job security, but also how to deal with work-life balances. And on the other hand, with regard to hired labor, we have in many European regions currently also a lack in infrastructures to provide, for example, housing in rural areas.
Yeah, and actually the question is very much in line with that. It's from a young colleague who asks, well, many young people want to become a farmer, but face all these hurdles and struggles and expensive land prices. So there is this gap between the recommendation and practice. What would be your recommendation, Alphonse?
I didn't get the point fully.
Yeah, so many young people actually want to become a farmer and want to be in the farming business, but they face struggles and expensive land prices. So now what?
if you do not have a business plan which is competitive, then you are in a problem. And we have seen also surely the problem that in agriculture and Western agriculture, you need eventually €1 million of starting capital. And that is a lot of money. And if you don't inherit it, it is difficult. But on the other hand, you also cannot expect to become a processor of cars if you do not have billions to invest to develop a product. So there are barriers of entrance, and we have to be aware that agriculture, like many other businesses, does not just offer opportunities for people who have just the wish to start a business. You have to be aware that you need capital, you need ideas which are not already occupied by other producers.
Yeah. In one of your policy briefs, you also recommend new farming ownership models. So this shared farming practices was also, that may also be a way to move forward. Murillo, you asked the question. So thanks. The questions are now working. So Alphonse, thanks. We go to the next pitch.
Okay.
I realize that we are in a relatively low building because the elevator pitches must be quite fast. Nevertheless, it's a good opportunity to speak about what you found in the Sure Farm project. So Peter, you are next. Take the floor, and we are ready to listen to you. The floor is yours, Peter.
Great. Thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. So 3 key findings from Work Package 4. The role of policy. Is it constraining or enabling resilience? First, we can say that public policies affect the resilience of farming systems in 2 different ways. First of all, public policies can either moderate or reinforce the pressure to change. So policies can shield farming systems, but they can also reinforce stresses or shocks. And this can occur, for example, through lax or tight regulation. So if there is societal demand for more animal welfare or environmentally friendly farming, then this can be reinforced through stricter regulations, or public policy can choose to put a little bit of a buffer between these new demands and farming systems. Public policy can also close down policy networks to keep it as in the good old times, or open up to new actors and other policy sectors or societal sectors. Public policy can influence public and professional debates, either towards more change or transition, or towards keeping the good old ways. And public policies can provide resources either unconditionally or with conditions that require adaptation or even a move towards transformation. And furthermore, public policies can then, if this pressure is either reinforced or moderated, then enhance or constrain the capability of farming systems to deal with these challenges in the 3 dimensions of robustness, adaptability, and transformability. And we have identified a broad range of instruments that address each of these 3 capacities, although most of the instruments, particularly in the CAP, were geared towards robustness and a little bit towards adaptability. This leads us to the second finding. The current CAP has been too focused on robustness, and that also with uneven success, and it constrains transformability. Why is this the case? First of all, most financial resources go into payments with quite weak conditions, and these payments compensate the lack of buffer resources rather than enhancing the resilience of the farming systems. And since most of these payments are linked to acreage, there is quite little access for small-scale farms and less land-intensive systems, like, for example, the broiler system in Sweden that we looked at, or the system in Lazio in Italy with perennial crops. Then government-supported risk management schemes are offered in a number of countries, but they struggle with effectiveness, and often they are also not very well accepted by the target groups. And then, in particular, many stakeholders in workshops found that there were undesirable effects of these robustness-enabling policies, in particular these payments with relatively weak conditions. They create disincentives to adapt or to transform. In the long run, they might even lead to the unlearning of adaptability or transformability, and they create a wrong illusion of stability. Furthermore, much fewer resources are devoted to programs that enhance adaptability, in particular in the second pillar, and transformability goals are mostly vague and rarely translated into strategies or instruments. However, our third finding is that the CAP after 2022 could enable resilience much better. The starting point would be to allow for more tailored policy mixes which address the specific resilience needs of each of Europe's farming systems. And also the CAP needs to develop a long-term vision. Where do we really want to go? Particularly in this new environment with climate change and more need for biodiversity conservation and so on. So to increase robustness, the most important point would be to conduct foresight exercises, which should then be closely linked into strategy development and also into outreach and engagement schemes to improve anticipation and what we call future literacy, the ability to read what is coming upon us. So the kind of exercises that Katharina has presented in her project, but at a larger scale and really more closely linked into policy making. To improve adaptability, we need, first of all, a coherent and sufficient remuneration of public goods, then less red tape, clearer, easier rules for access to adaptability enhancing programs, and then less administrative barriers when you are in those programs. And we need to close the gap between reflection and innovation and practice, in particular through more project-type funding and integrated advice for production and the provision of public goods, and more collaborative approaches for opening up and reconnecting agriculture with society. To improve transformability, we need more support for deep learning and niche innovations. We need to address lock-in mechanisms that keep people in the old ways of doing. We need to adopt more reflexive modes of governing. We should develop EIP Agri and LEADER into cross-sectoral support for rural cooperation. And generally, we need more funding for the creation, facilitation, and integration of cross-sectoral networks. And finally, the point beyond the CAP is that we generally need more internalization of externalities of farming, and we need to develop sustainable finance mechanisms because the CAP will not be able to provide all the funding for the adaptations and transformations that are needed. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Peter. Well, that was a long elevator ride, but also much to say about the policy perspective. Yeah, so one of your key messages was that you found that there is a lot of attention for this, what I called in my introductory talk this morning, more the narrow interpretation of resilience. So a lot of focus on robustness, but you argue that more is needed. And you give good recommendations to move towards adaptability and transformability. So thanks for that. Useful messages. Could I have some questions from the audience? No questions yet. And Peter, while we were waiting for the questions for Alphonse, you typed in people, the audience first need to digest and only then can ask questions. Yeah. So
yeah, that's a paradox. Yeah, the message is we need to open up, and then the audience is completely silenced. But Miranda, you certainly have a comment or question. Let's bridge the time.
Could you elaborate maybe a bit more on the differences between the farming systems that we looked at? So this was a very high level recommendations that you made. Do you see
differences across farming systems and regions? Yeah, I think this was one of the most important findings, that this robustness orientation was mostly working for systems that use a lot of land, and it didn't work very well for systems that are less land intensive. So one example was this hazelnut production system in central Italy, in Lazio. Another example was the vegetable and fruit production systems in the Masovian region in Poland. And the third one was the broiler production system in Sweden. And these three systems experienced much more pressure to adapt or even to transform. In particular, the broiler system in Sweden was faced by regulations that forced them really to change their production system. And then some support was provided through the second pillar programs to adapt the production systems. So that the system, under regulatory pressure, really has to move to a very different system. So therefore, I think what was very clear from the findings is that different farming systems also experience very different levels of support, and that the profile in terms of resilience is quite different. So if you receive a lot of payments through acreage-based direct payments, then you can go on with your current farming system for a while. But at the same time, that does not necessarily improve resilience. It compensates in many cases for a lack of resilience or a lack of profitability. And that is a concern, that this policy doesn't really support or incentivize an improvement in resilience capacities. It just helps less resilient systems to go on for a while, but that will certainly run into a dead end.
Yeah, that is very much in line with what Alfons and the team concluded on the low effectiveness of the young farmer payments. It is very much in the current system, but not in alternative systems. Let me see a question. Catherine asked to also reflect a bit on the UK example. So maybe say a few words about that?
Yeah, that is very interesting. So one of the cases was the intended or proposed policy design for the UK after Brexit. And that policy design was much more adaptation and transformation oriented. So we have to see whether that will actually materialize. But here it was very clear that the British government intended to move away from the traditional acreage-based support to really supporting public goods and more adaptation to the new challenges. So, and if that would actually materialize, it would be an example of an adaptation or even transformation-oriented policy design. And the key point is that the financial measures or the financial volume that is available in the CAP would be used through very different instruments.
Thank you very much there. And also Katharina has a question, and then we move on to Patrick. So Katharina wonders, this project type of policy, that's very interesting. But how can the European added value be justified with such policy approaches? So can you maybe elaborate a bit further on the ideas of the project type of policy?
Yeah, here the finding is that the current support, also in second pillar, is always formatted in kind of predefined measures. And the reason for that is the controllability from a financial and administrative point of view. But in particular, stakeholders told us that what they would need would be more support to develop, for example, integrated management schemes for natural resources in their region, or the program for integrated water management. And that is very difficult to fund from these programs because they have predefined measures which are therefore easy to control, but often they do not really fit the needs in the different regions. So here it would be good to move towards more project type funding, where, for example, a group of stakeholders, different actors, cross-sectoral coalitions could develop a project, which of course then needs to be vetted for its quality and additionality. And then funds would be available to, for example, improve the delivery or the sustainability of public goods in a region, or to move towards a better integration of biodiversity needs into a farming system and an agricultural landscape.
Yeah, so also you recommend from all the policy analysis much more contextualization of and local, putting the policies in the local context. Let's stop there, Peter, and your team. Thank you very much for these policy perspectives. Then we go to Patrick Rijtsma from Wageningen University, who presents from the more integrated perspective. What can you, from the integrated perspective, say about resilience of these European farming systems? Patrick, the floor is yours.
Good morning. I assume, there's also my screen. So farming systems in Europe are challenged, and we're also a bit challenged by this new system, but I think this time you can see my slide, and I assume I can also move forward. So this is work from a large team in Work Package 5, but actually everybody in SureFarm contributed to this. And I will say a few words about integrated resilience assessments. What do they reveal about resilience of farming systems in Europe? Well, we wrote about 1,000 pages about this, I think, and I will summarize it in just a few statements. So first of all, with regard to the current system, what our assessment shows us is that accumulating challenges cause farming systems to approach critical thresholds. And we have seen different types of farming systems, and we have 11 case studies. One example is the sheep system in Huesca in Spain, where we see that this system gets into a vicious cycle because of these different challenges that accumulate. Secondly, past strategies mainly focused on remaining economically viable, which is leading to a decline in the provision of public goods. And thirdly, the resilience of the farming systems is perceived as low to moderate, with robustness prevailing over transformability. So in many case studies have been able to remain robust, even though they're relatively close to critical thresholds. But this has mainly focused on remaining economically viable, which is also threatening transformability in the long term. However, strategies from the past are not sufficient to bring the desired social, economic, and environmental change. So these systems need more transformability. Well, with regard to the future, we can say that it is possible to improve sustainability and resilience, but there should be a focus on improving multiple functions and attributes at once. And this is a bit of a complex figure. It shows 22 resilience attributes, so attributes that can enhance resilience. And what we have seen, if you look at the green line, that strategies that have been implemented for current systems, they mainly focused on enhancing remaining reasonably profitable. But if we look at what is needed for the future, for moving towards desired alternative systems, we need to couple them better with local and natural capital. And that's partly what you see in the yellow lines. In addition to more coupling with local and natural capital, also we need to strengthen ecological processes, stakeholder collaboration, the institutional environment. But while all these different aspects should be strengthened, also farmers should remain reasonably profitable. And I think some of these were also mentioned by Katarina before, that it should be an integration on different dimensions. So policy should be based on a long-term vision, ensuring economic viability of the farming systems that ensure the provision of public goods. And all involved actors inside and outside the farming system need to collaborate in order to make a change toward business models that tackle these long-term challenges. So it's not only farmers that can do something about it, also the other actors need to take action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patrick. That was a dense presentation as well about these 1,000 pages, compliments there. So could you, based on all the work that you led, Patrick, on the integrated assessment of resilience, how could you say in layman terms, how is the resilience situation in all these systems in Europe? can we relax and sit back, or should we not relax and do something?
Well, I think that's also what I mentioned. Indeed, that well, we have observed quite well a relatively good robustness in many of the systems, and they are able to cope with challenges. But at the same time, we also see that they're continuously, well, for many of the challenges, the functions they need to provide, they're close to critical thresholds, so they feel challenged by that, and they need to remain economically viable, which is sometimes difficult, and that's why many strategies are also focused on that. While if you look at the sustainability aspect, as I mentioned in my presentation, many of the public goods are declining, so more is needed than trying to remain robust. Farmers and farming systems also need to improve their adaptability and even transformability to move towards more sustainable and resilient systems. And obviously, there's differences in the different 11 case studies, and we can also learn from that. I think some farming systems have more problems than others, and the directions in which they can and should go are also different.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so not relax and sit back. That's what you say. There's a question about is food security, is that not a public good? So are we then going to increase our imports to increase the public good, so the food?
So if well, yeah, food security obviously is not only a private good, but indeed also a public good delivered to other people in the system. But I don't think that food security is immediately threatened if farming systems are changing, or even if they produce, if yields would decrease. I mean, in general, it's feasible in most of the case studies to remain similar yields or even increase, especially in Eastern countries. A lot of increases are still possible, but at the same time, changing to more environmental sustainable practices. And yeah.
Yeah, the next question is a bit in line with that. So, okay, policymakers can do all kind of actions. We also heard from the presentation from Peter, but what should the other actors in the system do? I also asked that question to Katarina this morning. So it's not only the farmers and the policymakers, but who else is on the steering wheel? How do you see that, Patrick?
Yeah, so well, there's in most of the case studies, there are farming systems. There are many different actors, and often also industry is part of the system. So there are companies that process products, which should also collaborate and change. Prices are often very low for farmers, and in other parts, actors earn from that. So it's industry. It's, as I said, policymakers should stimulate the environment to change. There are also a lot of organizations like NGOs that can help to stimulate self-organization, learning, to give demonstrations, and to connect people in the farming system.
Yeah, it's good that we, after the next break, we hear from stakeholders in the field. So so let's see what they will say about their role and actions to take. A final question to you, Patrick. So we talk a lot about capacity to transform. It's important. What are good indicators to see if a farming system is having some capacity to transform?
Well, this relates a bit to the figure I was showing, which was probably too complex to digest now. But in general, there are general attributes that have been identified to be said to enhance resilience. But some have more potential or contribute more to robustness, and others contribute more to transformability. And for example, the attribute infrastructure for innovation, that is something that is very important also for transformability. But also social self-organization. So to be able to organize, to be able to learn, and well, these are three examples of attributes that are needed. But I think in general for transformability, as I also mentioned on that slide, you need improvements in all these different attributes.
Thanks for that. Good reflection. I come back also to these attributes, by the way, in the presentation on COVID. So it comes back there again. I get an announcement here that we have now 90 people in the audience. So quite a nice group. It's quite a challenge to ask a question then, I totally realize. I hope there's also some time later on in the coffee room again. Patrick, thanks a lot for this 1,000-page summary in 3 slides. Wow.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Erwin indicates to be ready. Then we go to the next presentation by Erwin Wouters from Ilvo in Belgium. And Erwin led the work on the roadmaps to resilience, so bringing a lot of things together from the project. Not such an easy task, Erwin. So there you go. Floor is yours.
Thank you, Miranda. I'm just waiting a few seconds to confirm that you see my slides. Do you see them? Yeah, nobody's talking. I continue talking then because I can't see the chat at this moment. So indeed, I'm going to present the work of work package 6 in the project. It's about deriving principles and roadmaps towards a resilience enabling environment.
Yeah, Erwin, so I get the message that you are not sharing your slides.
Okay, that's was what I was trying to.
Otherwise, the Spanish team should share if it doesn't work.
Okay, is this better?
Not yet. Yeah, it's coming. Yeah, it's there, Erwin. Go ahead.
Okay, so no.
Yeah, I think now you're trying with the two of you to share.
Yeah. So maybe the Javier can share if you
yeah,
want.
so Javier will do. He says no worries.
All right. So we have been investigating the behavior of the multitude of actors and how that is enabling or disabling resilience. Yeah, so you can go to the next slide. The first key message of this work package, if you can do the next slide, Javier. So obviously actors' decisions regarding how to use their resources, being financial resources, but also non-financial resources such as social capital or human capital, is influencing the resilience of the farming system. And obviously actors' decisions are determined as much by informal institutions such as norms, the culture of collaboration, innovativeness, subjective beliefs, as they are by formal or hard institutions such as policies. We did a stepwise analysis looking at past challenges, the potential impact, the actual impacts, and how farming system and enabling environment actors have been responding to these past challenges, shocks, and stresses. This analysis revealed several stylized patterns of systemic behavior that leads to failures. One example is shown here. It's the shifting the burden archetype, whereby actors use resources to solve or to implement short-term solutions, solving the symptoms of a certain challenge. Of course, that temporarily solves the issue, but it leads to, it leaves less resources to implement more fundamental solutions. And perhaps more importantly, it reduces the urgency of implementing more fundamental sources, which actually leave the system as vulnerable as before, or over time, perhaps even more vulnerable. We have identified several of such systemic stylized archetypes, and this has led to the identification of 6 principles, generic principles for how actors should act to enable resilience, which they are on the next slide, Javier. So if you can move, of course. So the first principle is to conduct more systemic in-depth analysis of the drivers of challenges and vulnerabilities of the system to these challenges. A second is assist the farming system to detect, assess, and address long-term trends. A third one is to shift resources towards building anticipatory capacity and responsive capacity, adaptability and transformability, especially when shocks continue to reoccur. A fourth one is to find a balance in putting resources, financial and non-financial resources, in immediate versus future challenges. A fifth one is to foster a diversity of responses rather than trying to go for the silver bullets, and so focusing too much on a limited set of actions when strengthening or when trying to strengthen resilience. And a sixth principle is to provide temporary resources to cope with the adverse consequences of a severe shock, but not as the solution, but only to buy time to implement more fundamental solutions that address the root causes of the vulnerability of the system to the challenge. And on the next slide, implementing these principles, they are quite generic, but implementing these principles, because they are the solutions are the way to implement the principles, so to develop roadmaps towards resilience, is very case study, region specific, farming specific, and because it deals with the actions, the decisions, the choices of a multitude of actors, they all need to be involved. So we need an approach like a policy dialogue process, which we have been doing, and then currently we are actually in the process of analyzing the final outcomes of this. In these policy dialogues, a mix of formal and informal institutions should be addressed, so not specific instruments especially withstand the tendency to add new instruments, but rather rethinking the mix. Another thing about these policy dialogues is that the issue needs to be ripe, and we did observe that it is very important to convince stakeholders, actors, and also about that and why enabling resilience does not equal to protecting status quo. And we also observed that at certain point, the role of researchers as an analyst meets its limits, because at some point, normative considerations regarding responsibilities of different actors, regarding expectations of different actors, will become more prominent in then deciding who needs to do what to implement the principles towards resilience. I end here.
Yeah, so these principles are, of course, nicely overlapping with recommendations that came from the previous presentations. For instance, this diversity that you mentioned as the fifth principle of building resilience is very much in line with what Peter also concluded on the policy, the need to look to diversity and contextualization of policies. I was talking to farmers about this fifth principle, and they said, yeah, more diversity. That's not exactly what my farm is at the moment. It's specialized, and my neighbor is also specialized, and the other neighbor is also specialized. So it's not really. We are not diverse. Erwin, so this diversity, can it also should it always be on farm level, or can it also be on a larger scale, so that if the complete region is diverse, so having different specialized systems, if you like, if then an extreme weather event happens, for instance, then at least not everyone is hit at the same time in the same way. So is it good enough also to build diversity on larger scales, so not within the farm?
Well, I would say it's even more important to look at diversity at a higher scale than just the individual farm level or even the individual plot level. Diversity doesn't necessarily imply that all farms should be multifunctional and very diversified, because that also, of course, comes with a cost. But more at the whole farming system, also including spatial diversity, is important. The right kind of farming or production systems in the right spot would also add to the resilience of the system as a whole.
Yeah, so this diversity indeed can be looked at the regional level. Thanks. Then there is a question from Alphonse, not so sure to whom it is. It seems to be asked to Patrick, but maybe Erwin, since Patrick doesn't have the microphone now, maybe Erwin, you also have a vision on that. So what are the limits of the farm size? So do you see any limits there? Bigger is better or smaller is better?
That's a difficult question. I mean, I know there are studies that in a specific location, given specific market conditions, etc., they do show that at certain points there are no economies of scale anymore, which would point to a certain maximum in terms of scale increase. But of course, that's a momentary analysis. If surrounding conditions change, maybe the limit is even higher. I mean, I surely think there are limits, but these limits are location specific, sector specific, and probably also dynamic, meaning they could change over time what the limit is to that.
Yeah, thanks for that. So you say it's not necessarily smaller the better, but there is limits to growth. That's what you indicate.
There are limits to growth. I think you need to have the right scale, not necessarily a very small or a very big one, just the right scale, which can be big in certain locations, but which is probably smaller in others.
Yeah.
Depending also on the sector and the markets you're serving.
Thanks a lot. That again, yeah, it's very much in line with other recommendations made so far. Thanks, Erwin. And it was especially difficult for you to present because your work is especially in the final part of the project, so it's still a bit ongoing. So thanks for giving your findings still.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks a lot. Then we continue to our next speaker, Kasia from Warsaw. Hello, Kasia. Good to see you in this seminar environment. I asked Kasia a very difficult question. So we looked at these 11 farming systems. So what have we learned from this diversity? And Kasia, you prepared some nice notes for that. The floor is yours. And to the audience and to the organizers, we may have not enough time to also do the COVID presentation. We'll see. We'll stop at 11:15 anyway. Kasia, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Erwin already mentioned that the location matters for the resilience, and I think here nicely comes my presentation about case studies diversity, and it also shows that location matters. So the first lesson is that resilience is context specific, so also the resilience needs of farming systems. And while challenges are everywhere pretty much the same about environment, economic, political, social, but those pressures are mediated in very different ways into the farming systems, and that depends on the specific context, biomaterial, institutional, economic. And we used to see this context in a simple way before, like that underdeveloped East has worse institutions or difficult economic context, and well-developed West is better off, but it's not anymore this simple way of looking. So it's more like accessibility of the systems, location of the systems, and it seems more to matter whether it's remotely or centrally located. It will be better seen on the next slide. The next slide shows the second lesson learned. First of all, that resilience capacities in our case study farming systems are overall low to moderate, and that robustness dominates. So independently if it's west or east of Europe, most of their cases show that robustness is the highest, although there are exceptions. And those exceptions shed some light, because exceptions are in green letters. And so you can see that in those regions, robustness is not prevailing. It is adaptability that prevails there. So what are those systems? Similarities. It is not certainly the type of production because it differs. but the type of the regions, because we have here the Spanish mountain and Romanian mountain areas, and it's the eastern of Germany. They are all border regions, so it suggests a bit that in the regions which are more remote, that this kind of systems located there cannot really rely on their reserves. They cannot really rely on buffer sources and build system reserves, so they are kind of be more like learning adaptability. They are a bit forced to be more adaptable. And that's the difference. And overall capacities of all farming systems were perceived as low to moderate. But again, we have exception of Northeast Romania, where capacities were assessed to be medium to high. So this system is mixed, so we can say it's like a bit about diversity. So it's also family farming system, a bit bigger farms than average Romanian farms. So this system is perceived like to be quite a lot self-dependent and assessed higher than other systems. And the last slide, please. It shows the third lesson we learned, that something different is system level, capacities at system level differ from those at farm level. And this is quite visible that at system level, robustness prevail is higher to adaptability and transformability. But at farm level, this order changes. The adaptability prevails, while robustness and transformability are assessed lower. So I was thinking what could be the explanation, and maybe it indicates that resilience is a bit like built bottom up, and that farms are more responsive than the systems. So in a way, the actors first become adaptable, and then we can say that system becomes adaptable. That's why in the system level, robustness still prevails. What at farm level, we can see more that adaptability prevails. So that would be the three key points from so diverse, so many different systems. Thank you.
Kasia, thanks a lot. That was a very strong conclusion. And while looking at your last slide, I was thinking about the words that Katarina mentioned this morning. Katarina mentioned we need this transition. If it's not now, when will it happen? We need it now. Well, you just showed in your final slide in these red colored letters that the capacity to make this transformation is not strong yet. So in that sense, you confirm that worry, and you confirm the words from Katarina that it's important to work on it, because if it's not now, when will it happen? Thanks a lot, Kasia. We do not go to questions from the audience because I would like to go to the next presenter. Thanks a lot for the very strong overview from the different regions.
Thank you very much.
Robert, and I would like to give the floor to you. So we move to the risk management domain. Risk management is inherently connected to resilience. Everyone has that feeling already. So what are the highlights that you would like to share with us, Robert? The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity. I hope you see my slides. There we are. The opportunity to summarize key findings from Work Package 2, where many colleagues were concerned with risk management and how this is connected to resilience. We conducted both quantitative surveys, qualitative interviews, and a lot of data work to tap on this question. And the key findings are as follows. First of all, the slides are not moving. There we are. Well, obviously farmers perceive a wide variety of challenges that affect their farms that they perceive as a risk. So this not necessarily only comes from market pillars or environmental shocks, but also has social challenges and institutional challenges and risks. So all that matters and all that is very specific to farms, specific to farming systems. So there's obviously no possibility to really generalize. We also see that farmers tap on many different strategies. both in their individual portfolio, but also comparing across the entire range of farming systems that we looked at. And I guess very relevant to highlight here, this is not only an on-farm issue, but it is also a risk-sharing issue that is very relevant. And along these lines, there was specifically highlighted the role of learning and cooperation across farmers, but also other actors along the value chain that really matter in that perspective on risk management. And this is also highlighted in this second key findings, that this is really going far beyond the individual farm, and many actors are involved in risk management strategies. And clearly to flag here, strategies go and should further go strongly beyond the level of individual farms. So there's a lot of cooperation between farms, learning from each other. There is cooperation along the value chain. There are other actors like financial institutions that play a very viable role in risk management, and this needs to be a picture beyond the individual farm. And finally, we highlighted that there are many opportunities to complement the existing portfolio that farms and also other actors are using. So there are opportunities for novel risk management approaches. So this could be, for example, new forms of insurance solutions like index insurance solutions, but there are also many technological innovations upcoming and shall be integrated. For example, we have highlighted in our project the role of satellite imagery for insurance solutions, but more general, I guess the question of digitalization will play a very vital role in not only improving the design of specific instruments, but also enforcing and facilitating the exchange and the cooperation that we highlighted as being so crucial. So with that, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Robert. Also there, so much work done, and then it's quite a challenge to bring key messages in 3 slides. So what I would like a bit more reflection about from you is traditionally, we see risk management very much as dealing with contracts and insurance and getting some extra loan maybe from the bank. So you really made a step forward in looking.
No, I don't hear you anymore.
At risk management in a broader perspective. Well, I wanted Robert to give a bit more reflection on that, but I think we are not connected anymore. So, Robert, you're not hearing me? No, I think not. Well, then let's stop for now. I see that the speakers from after the break already come in. Let's take a break, walk a bit around, or go to the networking room. And, well, Robert, thanks for the presentation. See you in exactly 11:30, because we have very good speakers from the field, and we are eager to hear what they have to say and, well, share with us. So see you at 11:30 sharp. Then have a nice break together.